Amira once told me, we were talking one time about the checkpoints, which I'm going to talk about a little bit now. And she said one line. She once told me a line which has really forever stayed with me, which is, the problem with the occupation is not so much the stealing of land, because theoretically you can give back land, but it's the stealing of one's time. And it's that time that you can't give back. And so when she talks about the checkpoints and the checkpoints that are being imposed on the Palestinians, in theory, the settlements may one day go away. In theory, the wall may come down. In theory, the entire West Bank and Gaza Strip may become a Palestinian state, in theory. But one thing that we will never, ever be able to gain back is the time that we spent at those checkpoints, waiting and waiting and waiting, just to be able to do the basic things of life, like go to school, go to the hospital, meet your friends, and meet your family. And so Amira always has this great way of bringing things down to what real life is like, something that I, being one of the privileged, don't have to experience. I don't have to live behind the checkpoints. I experience them, but I don't have to go through the exact same situation. So thank you very much, Amira. So what I wanted to talk about was, I wanted to spend just a little bit of time, I'm not going to be too long, and I'm going to open it up for questions sooner rather than later, about the closure system in general. And I want to go back to the theory of Israel as a state, and what it meant to create this state, and how that theory has actually now permeated into what Palestinians live today, now in the year 2006. And so I want to begin by saying that one of the challenges that Israel has always faced is, how is it that they contain this demographic threat? The demographic threat being the Palestinians, who are not Jewish. And how is it that Israel remains a Jewish state with a Jewish majority, if that's what it means, when it's in the presence of so many Palestinians? I mean, Israel was imposed upon the Palestinians, not Palestinians imposed upon Israel. And so the challenge for Israel has always been, how is it that we maintain a Jewish majority in the land, in this state? And there were a number of means of doing this, maintaining the Jewish majority. The first, of course, was in 1948, when thousands of Palestinians were either expelled or fled their homes, and were never allowed to return back. And so the way that they maintained the Jewish majority was to actually create a majority, expel or cause people to flee, and while simultaneously allow for the immigration of Jews into, unfettered immigration of Jews into what is now Israel. And that was one means of dealing with this demographic threat. And you deal with it by creating a numbers balance, increase the number of Jews, decrease the number of Palestinians. And so that was something that was done in 1948. Now that same theory, that same tactic, is no longer something that's acceptable in the year 2006. I mean, the idea of wholesale flight of a population is something that is no longer considered acceptable in this day and age. I don't think that it's going to happen again. But what is acceptable is the idea of containment of a demographic threat. And so how is it that you contain this demographic threat? Well, it was the means that was used from all the way from 1948 until today was to try to contain the Palestinian presence inside, whether it's Israel or now the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And so the closure that you hear about today, I'm sure that when you read the newspapers, that you see things like checkpoints, or you hear about these checkpoints. The checkpoints are not actually at all new. This is not the advent of something that happened in the year 2000 as the result of suicide bombings, not at all. This came as the result of way back from 1948, when Palestinians who, such as my parents, who lived inside Palestinian towns, including such as Nazareth, which is inside Israel, were subjected to a series of closures, and where they had to actually obtain Israeli permission to be able to move from one area to the next. So, for example, my father and my mother, although they are Israeli citizens who lived in Nazareth, up until 1966, they actually required Israeli permission to be able to go to the neighboring city, which is 30 minutes away. And that permission, as Amira said, is not something that's always given. It's simply the ability to apply for permits, but doesn't mean that you will always be granted a permit. And in the case of many Palestinians up until 1966 who lived inside Israel, many people were not actually granted permits. Earlier this morning, I was telling you the story of my father, who after his brother passed away, after his brother was killed, he thereon after was never allowed to obtain a permit. He was now considered to be a security risk, even though he had done nothing other than lose a brother. And so that system of closure, that system of permits, ended inside Israel for Palestinians inside Israel in 1966, but then ended up being replicated in 1991 and continues to this very day. So what is the permit system? What is the closure system? What is it entirely all about? And what it is, this is the question that I'm asking. I'm going to answer it by sort of referring, do you have another one? No, if you've got another one with the areas, that other one. That's good. What you see on this map is you're going to see a couple of things. And the whole idea, as I said, was how do you contain the demographic threat while at the same time try to take as much Palestinian land as possible. And so it was these two fundamental tendencies that have been driving what you now see and what you now read about today. So on this map, there's a few things that I want you to pay attention to. And the first is that you see those dark, they look sort of brownish, blackish areas. Those are the black dots. I don't think you can see them very well, but those are the Israeli settlements. And I'm going to talk about those in a second. And then you've got this kind of yellowy, brownish spots. Those are where the vast majority of Palestinians live, and I'm going to describe this entire system. So what you basically see on this map was, because there was this tendency of how is it that Israel is to contain this demographic threat, there were two things that ended up being put into place. One is actual cut off the people from the land, and the second policy is to actually take the land itself. And so one of the most ironic things that happened during the so-called peace process during the period 1993 to the year 2000 was that rather than we actually moving towards a system where this was actually being eliminated, it actually led to the legalization of this entire system that you see here, which is in many respects does replicate apartheid. So what does this whole system mean? The first is that following the 1993 so-called peace agreements, where everybody was looking at handshakes and agreements and all of that sort of stuff, and all of your media coverage was dominated by this agreement here, this handshake there, these people, oh, can't they just simply get along and there's going to be peace? What was going on underneath, which very few people, apart from Amira, were actually reporting, was the subtext of it and the continuation, in fact, if not the cementing in of the policy of closure and the cementing in of the occupation. And so there were two things that ended up happening. The first was that more checkpoints ended up going up around Palestinian areas. For the first time, let me back up. For the first time, you actually saw on the West Bank that areas were suddenly divided. Rather than it simply being a question of one entire territory, you actually saw the division of territory into what were called Areas A, Areas B, and Areas C. And don't worry about the letters, it's not a big deal. But the basic essence of it was that there were suddenly things called Palestinian areas. And there were suddenly things called non-Palestinian areas. And so how is it that you define a Palestinian area from a non-Palestinian area? Well, you have to have some sort of delineation. And the way that you delineate it is by putting up checkpoints around the Palestinian areas.